everyone. My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am a director of UC Berkeley's Social Science Matrix. And I am delighted to welcome you to today's panel on Sai Balakrishnan's book, Shareholder Cities, Land Transformations Along Urban Corridors in India. Shareholder Cities offers a deep dive into the social underpinnings of urban modernity in India as conflicts between urban and rural elites play out along the country's new industrial corridor regions. Today's event is part of our Author Meets Critics series, which features critically engaged discussions about recent books by faculty in UC Berkeley's Social Science Division. Please also note that this event is being co-sponsored by UC Berkeley's Institute for South Asian Studies, so we're very happy to work with our colleagues here. At Matrix, we have some very exciting events coming up in the next few weeks. Tomorrow, we have an online discussion on foundation grant seeking in the social sciences, and you can still sign up for it on the Matrix website. On December 3rd, we will have another Author Meets Critics event with Professor Neil Flickstein on his book, The Banks Did It, An Anatomy of the Financial Crisis. He will be in conversation with Professor Adam Tooze from Columbia University. And on December 13th, we have a Matrix On Point event on democracy, misogyny, and digital media. So if you haven't already, we encourage you to sign up for these events and for the Matrix newsletter. Now, without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. So we have a really stellar lineup today. I'm very happy to introduce everyone. So Sai Balakrishnan is an assistant professor of city and regional planning in a joint appointment with the Department of City and Regional Planning and Global Metropolitan Studies. Her research and teaching broadly pivot around global urban inequalities with a particular focus on urbanization and planning institutions in the global South and on the spatial politics of land use and property. So Sai, I don't know if we can see you, but if you want to turn on your camera, you're welcome to do so. Yes, there you are. So her recent book, Shareholder Cities, Land Transformations Along Urban Corridors in India, looks at the conflicts and struggles over the commodification and decommodification of land in India's urbanizing countryside. Her work has been published in a wide range of reviews, and her research has also been quoted in media outlets, including The Guardian and Open Magazine. Michael Watts is, hello, Michael. I don't know if I can see you, is class of 63 and Chancellor's Professor of Geography Emeritus and co-director of Development Studies at UC Berkeley, where he taught for 40 years. He served as the director of the Institute of International Studies from 1994 to 2004, was director of Social Science Matrix from 2019 to 2020. He served on the board of advisors of a number of nonprofits, including Food First and the Pacific Institute, and was chair of the board of trustees of the Social Science Research Council. Michael is a member of the British Academy, a Guggenheim Fellow in 2003, and was awarded the Victoria Medal by the Royal Geographical Society in 2004 and the Berlin Prize by the American Academy in Berlin in 2016. And finally, we have Sharad Chari. Sharad is Associate Professor. Hello, Sharad. Sharad is Associate Professor of Geography at UC Berkeley, affiliated to the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research in South Africa. He has written an agrarian historical ethnography of an industrial town in South India titled Fraternal Capital. He has edited books and has completed a monograph on the remains of 20th century racial segregation and struggle in Durban, South Africa, titled Apartheid Remains. He is currently working on queer biography at Apartheid's End and a multi-site project on oceanic capital in the Southern African Indian Ocean. Sharad is on the Berkeley editorial team at Critical Times. So I will let the three of you take it from there. Thank you so much for what promises to be a really wonderful conversation. And I now turn it over to Sai for the opening presentation.
All right, well, a big thank you to Marion and the Social Science Matrix, and to Sarah Lee for all her organizing help, to Chuck for all the technical help, and also to the Institute for South Asian Studies, which has been a wonderful institutional home since I joined Berkeley. It's really a huge privilege and a pleasure to be in conversation with Michael and Sharad. So my book looks at these massive new infrastructure / logistics projects of economic corridors. And I first got intrigued by these economic corridors as a doctoral student in 2010, because these corridors represented a new spatial form of urbanization. It was very clear in 2010 that urbanization was exploding beyond the territorial boundaries of the city, and that some of the most decisive and fraught urban conflicts and struggles were taking place not within the cities of Mumbai and Pune, but in the corridor regions connecting these cities. And when I started field research, it became instantly clear that I could not understand urban change along these economic corridors without simultaneously bringing in agrarian change. And for this reason, it's a rare treat to be in conversation with Michael and Sharad, two of the foremost agrarian studies scholars. And I'm very eager to hear from them on the urgent and creative ways in which these inherited disciplinary silos of urban studies and agrarian studies need to be breached and transgressed. And one could argue that agrarian studies does a better job of this than urban studies does. So by way of context, these economic corridors are the empirical and methodological focus of my book. And these corridors are ambitious infrastructural and logistics projects. And they're fundamentally reorganizing the shape of urbanization. Now, it's very important to stress that these corridors are not unique to India. They're being aggressively pursued by former socialist and communist countries as a way of transforming their quote unquote lethargic agrarian societies into globally competitive urban societies. And just given the sheer scale and size of these economic corridors, the UN Habitat, for instance, calls them the shape of things to come. Now, for India's policymakers, these new economic corridors are the socio-technical catalysts for new forms of urban agglomeration and urban modes of governance. These corridors are expected to be the spines along which special economic zones, SEZs, container ports, and other urban logistics enclaves will be built. At its core, these new economic corridors are about the transformation in land. Agricultural land, which was one of the most protected commodities in predominantly agrarian state-led economies, is now getting transformed by these economic corridors and their related urban enclaves into a fungible real estate asset. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, as a way of opening up some of the main arguments of the book, I'll focus on two puzzles around these agrarian urban corridors, and I'll end with the question of what is to be done. So the first puzzle is an economic geography puzzle. So as I said, these economic corridors are opening up vast swaths of agricultural land to private infrastructural and speculative capital. But when you map out where the private capital in the form of SEZs and other urban enclaves are clustering, you'll realize that private capital is not evenly spreading out across the national space economy. Instead, urban and logistics enclaves are largely clustering in certain regions, and these are former Green Revolution regions. So you can see in this map here that the Green Revolution roughly traces an arc that stretches from the northwest of India, and the northwest of India is the states of Punjab and Haryana, which are at the epicenter of the ongoing and very important farmers' protests that many of you may be following. And it traces an arc from the northwest of the country to the southeast. And these are also the sites of some of the most volatile infrastructural conflicts. So the most ambitious of these new economic corridors, for instance, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, almost neatly overlaps onto this Green Revolution arc. By extension, the new SEZs and other urban logistics enclaves are bypassing the regions that were bypassed by the Green Revolution. The bypassed regions are marked here in brown. And for instance, you'll see this region to the north of the country, this brown swath, which is at the India-Nepal border. And this is the Lower Gangetic Plain. And the Lower Gangetic Plain is one of the most economically distressed regions in India. And this is also the bypassed region which serves as India's vast and most exploited labor reserve. It's from these regions that migrant workers make arduous spatial journeys across the width of the country to work in the urban enclaves in the former Green Revolution arc. And this, of course, this uneven spatial development was made brutally visible last year during the COVID lockdown and the migrant crisis. This then is one of the key puzzles that I wanted to track in this book on how the Green Revolution regions, which became the sites of regional caste-based agrarian accumulation, are now quote unquote ripe to leverage the gains of urban speculative capitalism. In other words, there's a clear prior Green Revolution geography of agrarian uneven development, and the new economic corridors and urban enclaves are accreting onto these prior uneven agrarian geographies. And also very, very importantly, these Green Revolution regions themselves accrete onto late colonial era irrigation canals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? So what you have here when you map the clustering of the new urban logistics enclaves is it's clearly visible the agrarian colonial origins of uneven spatial development. So there's almost a remarkable path legacy here, the regions that were the beneficiaries of late colonial era famine protection canals became the key sites of Green Revolution agrarian accumulation. And these are the very regions that are now the most frenzied sites of urban speculative capitalism. So in short, one of the key questions that animates the book is what new narratives of urbanization arise when older histories of agrarian capitalism and agrarian caste class formation collide, collude, and recombine with the new economic corridors and corridor cities. Now, in asking this question, I am situating my work within the urban Marxist scholarship, but also pushing back against metropolitan Marxism. Within critical urban scholarship, India's land transformations, India's ongoing land transformations, are largely analyzed using concepts that emerged in the 1970s and 80s when Western Marxists were trying to make sense of rising land prices, of gentrification, and rent strikes in Western cities. It's during this time, it's within this context that David Harvey formulates his very influential accumulation by dispossession thesis, followed by Neil Smith's brilliant rent gap thesis. However, because of the US's very specific trajectories of agrarian capitalism, the agrarian question is largely missing from this 1970s critical urban scholarship on property and land rent. And it's these theories of real estate, stripped of the agrarian question, that uncritically traveled to India and much of the global south, with the result that economic corridors and urban enclaves in India are often analyzed with scant disregard for agrarian political economy and with an almost complete elision of the agrarian actors who are the key drivers of exclusionary urban change. So this brings me to the second puzzle, which is related to this earlier argument that the agrarian question is implicated in the urban question. And the second puzzle is a property puzzle. So my book focuses on the Mumbai-Pune Expressway, the Mumbai-Pune Economic Corridor, which you can see marked here in brown. The Mumbai-Pune Expressway was the first economic corridor to be completed in 2001. It was one of the earliest logistics projects within the context of economic liberalization that was officially announced just a decade earlier in 1991. And it was a blueprint for the National Economic Corridor policy. And again, as you can see in this map, the Mumbai-Pune Economic Corridor and more broadly, the urban and logistics infrastructures and enclaves are largely concentrated in this region of Western Maharashtra. Western Maharashtra was also the epicenter of the Green Revolution, marked here in green. Western Maharashtra is home to one of the most powerful agrarian lobbies in India, the sugar lobby. India is the second largest exporter of sugar in the world after Brazil, and more than 40% of India's sugar exports come from Western Maharashtra. And those of you who are familiar with India's electoral politics will instantly recognize that Western Maharashtra is the home constituency for some of the most powerful politicians of agrarian sugar origins, such as Sharad Pawar. Now, here's another map. And what you'll notice here is that in the Western Maharashtra region, it's not only that the new economic corridors and urban enclaves are accreting onto the prior Green Revolution region, but Western Maharashtra also has a very specific agrarian property institution. As you can see in this map, Western Maharashtra has one of the densest concentrations of sugar cooperatives, and it's these sugar cooperatives that are now being reworked into new real estate townships and other urban enclaves. So for grounding the political ecology of sugar and sugar cooperatives as the basis for urban real estate takes us to the heart of the second puzzle. Why was sugarcane organized as cooperatives in Western Maharashtra? Sugarcane, after all, is a paradigmatic cash crop of racialized capitalism. In the New World, sugarcane was organized around the plantation logics of enslaved labor, what Wendy Woolford, in analyzing the new enclosures, calls the logics of the plantational scene. In contrast to the New World, as post-colonial historians like Shahid Amin point out, India is a quote-unquote rare instance in the annals of a plantation crop like sugarcane, close quote. Not only is sugarcane not organized as plantation economies, but more importantly, sugarcane was organized in the seemingly benign organizational form of cooperatives, and the members of these sugar cooperatives were largely smallholders with around 2 to 3 hectares of land. And these sugar cooperatives later became the key institutions of agrarian state capture during the Green Revolution. So in short, it's these sugar cooperatives as property institutions that enabled the transformation of peasant cultivators from the late colonial period into an urban propertied class in the early 21st century. A focus on property institutions like sugar cooperatives then helps us understand why agrarian petty proprietors in India are not always dispossessed in these land commodification processes, but instead agrarian petty proprietors very often are complicit in the making of exclusionary real estate markets, right? And connecting this back to the earlier point on critical urban scholarship, which largely derives from the experiences of Western cities, the focus on petty proprietors and on agrarian cooperatives in enabling land commodification in India's urbanizing countryside shifts our focus away from the urban fractions of capital that have been the focus of Western urban Marxist scholarship from the 1970s onwards, and instead forces us to confront this tricky political reality of agrarian petty proprietors as the key protagonists in the making of exclusionary real estate markets. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like on the ground, one of the main case studies in my book is Magarpata city, which I call the city of sugar. In Magarpata city, former sugarcane growers were not evicted or dispossessed to make space for a new urban enclave, but instead they became 100% shareholders of a new real estate company that governs this urban enclave. And it's very important to note that most of these sugarcane shareholders are smallholders. They used to own between 2 to 5 acres of land. So in other words, petty proprietors are now shareholders of these new real estate companies. And it's for this reason that Magarpata city is often celebrated within business schools and policy circles as a case of quote unquote inclusive capitalism. These new cities of sugar, however, are far from inclusive. They exclude the landless who used to labor on these sugarcane fields, because both sugar cooperatives and the new real estate companies are premised on property ownership. And the book derives its title, Shareholder Cities, from this new mode of urban governance where agrarian landowners, very often smallholders, are conscripted as real estate shareholders and the distributional implications of these shareholder cities. Okay? Which brings me to my last and final point on this question of what is to be done. Because what we're seeing in India, what we're seeing in these corridor regions is a frenzied and accelerated process of land commodification that excludes the landless. And land commodification is legally enabled by the economic liberalization reforms of 1991 and after. Right? But the timing of these reforms is also very important, because at the same time that economic liberalization was introduced in India, officially introduced in India, enacted in India in the early 1990s, when the central government was liberalizing the Indian economy, there was also a parallel trend of democratic deepening. This was the time in the early 1990s when a new local democratic institution was constitutionally enshrined. And this local democratic institution is called the Gram Sabha. It's a new public assembly with statutory powers. And in my book, in my research, I vest hope in these Gram Sabhas as a Polanyian counter movement. Now, of course, it may seem paradoxical to vest hope at the scale of the local state, right? Because on the one hand, I've selected these economic corridors rather than the city as the unit of analysis, because it's at the scale of the economic corridors that we can fully grasp the scale of capital accumulation in India. And yet I'm proposing that local democratic institutions be the brakes, be the counter movements that can slow down and even reverse these new market relations in land. And I'll just end with why I would argue that rethinking the local state is crucial for democratization. At its simplest, these Gram Sabhas help us reclaim the citizen as opposed to the shareholder, the propertied shareholder, as the key constituents in these land struggles. But more pragmatically, these economic corridors and logistics infrastructures are crucial for the circulation of capital, right? And it's not surprising, as you can see in this image, that some of the most effective protests against these economic corridors have symptomatically taken place via occupation of these very corridors. So even though the Gram Sabhas are at a local scale that does not match the scale of capital accumulation, like strategically cited protests, Gram Sabhas can effectively function as a quote unquote holdout to interrupt capital. And I'll end with a very sober reminder that under Modi's authoritarian regime, a number of activists in India have been detained since 2018 under charges of being urban Maoists. The youngest of these actors is 35-year-old Mahesh Raut, who has been mobilizing indigenous groups, Adivasis, in the state of Maharashtra to form Gram Sabhas against the huge extractive mining industrial complex in the region. And this speaks to the potency of Gram Sabhas, that a reactivation of the Gram Sabhas as public assemblies is threatening enough for corporate capital and an authoritarian state that it warrants the arrest of activists like Mahesh Raut. So I'll stop here, and I very much look forward to Michael and Sharad's comments and the conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Sai. Real pleasure to hear you speak. Hello to everyone, Sharad included, Marion. It's a great pleasure to be able to say a few words about this outstanding book. Let me say immediately, if it's not perfectly obvious, I'm not a scholar of South Asia or India, and neither am I a scholar of urbanism. What little I know about South Asia, I have acquired over the years from my students, Sharad included, Patrick Heller, Asher Gertner, Adam Jadhav, but they can't be responsible for my ignorance. So my comments, I will be approaching your book from a rather different vantage point, and I'll leave it to Sharad to dig into the weeds and details of Indian political economy. I'm going to begin by saying a few things about what I like about the book. I could spend my whole time singing the praises of the book. It's really an outstanding piece of work, but I'd like to flag three things, if I can, before I open up to a series of questions. The first is the sophistication and the granularity of the way in which Sai reads across these comparative cases, these three urban corridors. She's on the one hand deeply sensitive to the legacies of history, the particular rounds of accumulation, the Green Revolution in particular, but also to the details of locale and the particular operations of social and class power. She retains a certain openness with respect to the way in which capitalist development occurs, and has yet not abandoned the hard edges of political economy, so to say. This whole study is in fact located at the intersection of what she calls liberalization and decentralization. And not least, she has a wonderful eye for a telling detail. In one of the case studies, she invokes in particular the crucial role of a particular level of Indian bureaucracy, the SDO, and its critical role, whether it's present or not, and who is present or not, in terms of the ways in which trust is built up in these institutions that she's trying to highlight for us, popular assembly, if you like. She's already referred to, for example, this sugar cooperative as being a crucial vehicle for, on the one hand, the growth of an agrarian elite through the Green Revolution, and is so important in understanding the transition and the form in which that intersects with urban corridors, real estate speculation. And yet at the same moment, she'll then turn to another cooperative form with a different commodity in a different part of Maharashtra to show that in fact, under a different set of circumstances, the cooperative fulfills a very different set of dynamics. So it's this granularity and the dialectical way she treats her three cases that is for me so deeply impressive. Secondly, there's in a sense, the narrative arc of the book itself. She begins, as she began this talk, with infrastructure, massive city building, mega projects, uneven development, and so on. But we quickly realize as she moves her way through these three cases that she has, as we say, bigger fish to fry. It's the unraveling and recomposition of dominant caste clusters. It's the changing cleavages within and across classes. It's the legacies of different property regimes. All of these things, though, are put to the service of something that she gets to at the end of the book and at the end of her talk just a second ago, which is the conditions of possibility for popular assembly, deliberation and negotiation, and the possibility of those things happening that do not exclude the non-propertied classes. So she ends her book actually with what she calls a billion-dollar question. What democratic institutions are required to regulate land use and property, and at the same time generate the possibility of new public spheres in India? And last, if I can be utterly provincial, it is really great to see and read a book that takes geography and geographers seriously. As you well know, Sai, you know, we geographers feel like we don't get no respect, other than David Harvey. It's a treat to have you not only walk through David's wonderful work, but Neil Smith and Sharad and Asher Gertner and Vinay Gidwani and Deb Cohen and so on. And of course, all of that stems from her concern with what she calls uneven development. And there's more than an echo, I think, in this book of earlier geographical work. Doreen Massey's wonderful early work on spatial divisions of labor, different periods of accumulation building upon one another and their consequences. And whilst Henri Lefebvre certainly isn't a geographer, none that we claim it, him as one, of course, his notions of territory and the ways in which different spaces intersect and overlap, what he called hyper-complexity, is really central to the types of arguments that Sai is making. So those are just three things I found deeply admirable. It's a political economy sensitive to different periods, different rounds of accumulation across and within spaces, the path dependencies that are created, and always rooted through particular local class configurations, through particular institutions, property, of course, in particular, and whether and how that creates spaces for this robust public sphere. Really terrific. So, Sai, I'm going to pose three preposterously broad questions. They all take the same form. One is, what does this book and this analysis have to say about the classical agrarian question? What does this book have to say about neoliberalism and the way in which neoliberalism is typically deployed in the political economy of development? And then what does this book have to say about the current Indian moment, Hindutva, Modi, and you gestured to it just a second ago, the current farmer protests? So let me spend a couple of moments on each of these things. The classical agrarian question. Well, of course, Kautsky is the central figure here at the end of the 19th century, saying, how is capital taking hold of agriculture? And there were typically three moments in that process. How were classes, agrarian producers, in some sense being differentiated? How was agriculture related to industry and wider processes of capitalist development? And what was the politics of the agrarian transformation, particularly given, in Kautsky's sense, a moment, the extension of the political franchise? And this led to, as Sai well knows, a big discussion about different paths or trajectories of agrarian transformation. The American road, the smallholder road, or the English capitalist road, or what was called the Juncker road, the Prussian road. All of these are different types of trajectories. And more recently, Henry Bernstein, a very central theoretician in these debates, has talked about certain aspects of the agrarian question being resolved, as he put it. And one of those resolutions had to do with the decreasing significance of land. So in light of all of that, Sai, my question would be to you then, how do you think about your story in relationship to those types of literatures? This isn't a story, obviously, of accumulation with dispossession. It's a curious case. There is a type of dispossession in the sense of loss of land, but the acquisition of other assets, smallholders even. And you talk about a remarkable case where a hectare and a half of land might have 70 or so co-owners, all of whom become shareholders. But this is a very different type of riff, if you like, on agrarian trajectories. There is, it's true, processes of exclusion in some of the cases that you talk about, and the rise of very precarious circumstances, particularly in the remote non-green revolution areas, where non-propertied laborers are excluded from the potential benefits or the potential forms of incorporation into these property regimes. But the larger question here then is, do we have here something like a very different form of agrarian transformation and trajectory? I was thinking particularly of other circumstances in which you have that type of dynamic of inflationary land values. China is the obvious case. Sharad and my colleague Yu Tianxin has written about this, of course, in China. A different set of actors, a different set of circumstances, but all of this points to that larger question of how and what this portends as a form of agrarian transformation peculiar to not just India, but perhaps to this particular moment of financialized global capitalism. You focus in particular, or these case studies focus in particular on the third aspect of the classical agrarian question, the politics. And she does this in a compelling way by looking particularly at the role of dominant caste middle peasants. Middle peasants is a term that goes back actually to the agrarian question, but particularly to the work of anthropologist Eric Wolf, who saw middle peasants as being so key in these agrarian transitions. Sai is particularly interested to see, in relationship to where they're located and the forms of caste and relations of production in which they're embedded, how in fact they do or do not participate in these emerging urban corridors. So again, then this is a very interesting set of circumstances that she's described in which there are potential cross-caste and cross-class coalitions emerging in some of these spaces in relationship to these urban corridors, none of which this should imply equity. She makes the point that there are complicated processes of enclosure, of inclusion and exclusion and so on. But this seems to me to be a very different type of agrarian transition. Let me just pose with a couple of three little questions for you on this. I wonder, Sai, in your Magarpata case, what role you think the fact that these are cooperatives, in other words, they have particular relations of production rooted in production, very different from the other two cases. This is what Michael Burwell, I suppose, would call production politics. What role that plays as, in addition to the agrarian elites, their networks, their caste dominance and so on, in the type of story that you tell. I'd also like you to talk a little bit about Mike Levian's book, Accumulation Without Development, in a special economic zone in a different part of India, which seems to me to have similar similarities and differences that you might want to talk about. And last, if I could, this is not exactly a critique, but it's as near a critique as I can get, Sai, is that on page 155, when you're summing up your argument, you refer to this path dependency and the importance of history and historical legacies and these first rounds of green revolution-based accumulation. You say that these urban corridors settle upon older forms of agrarian capitalism. I wonder whether that's quite right, Sai. Isn't it settling? Doesn't seem to me quite right. It's what David Stark, I think, used the term recombinant capitalism. There's a type of complicated set of recombinations at work here. All right, let me jump very quickly to my second question, neoliberalism. This is not a term that Sai used. I couldn't find it in the index. I'm not suggesting that's a problem. I'm just simply saying that she talks of liberalization as being so key to her story. But of course, neoliberalism has so come to dominate the political economy of development, the various forms that it takes, the types of instruments and policies that circulate through the political economy of development, ensuring some type of market encasement and so on. And there's a whole body of work that focuses perhaps less on property and markets and competition than on the types of neoliberal selves, market-ready citizens that are endeavored to be produced through these neoliberal projects, the centrality of the community as a vehicle for neoliberal development. And then, of course, we have our colleague, Wendy Brown, who, among others, has been talking about the radical undoing of the demos that comes with neoliberalism. So I'm wondering then, if I could just have you reflect a little bit upon not so much why you didn't use that frame, but how your story relates to it. A part of your concern with popular assemblies and the Gram Sabha that you talk about, it seems to me stands awkwardly with the idea that market relations, or for that matter, shareholder forms of capitalism, don't necessarily have a space for these types of democratic deliberation. I also think, incidentally, I just read Brett Christopher's book on rentier capitalism, that your cases are compelling examples of the ways in which, this is the rent gap theory in a different way of Neil Smith, of course, of the ways in which these urban corridors, depending on their situation and class and caste configuration, create all manner of rents understood as income that's derived from the ownership or possession or control of a relatively scarce asset under conditions of relatively limited competition. It seems to me this is a classic case of a proliferation of financially driven forms of rentier capitalism. Last comment, the current moment. Obviously, the farmer protests that began around the new legislation in September 2020, and these extraordinary protests, not only in Haryana and Punjab, but in Uttar Pradesh and all parts of the country. I wonder then, one, how you see those activities, those protests, that mobilization in relation to the story that you've told on the one hand. And secondly, how does your story relate to Modi and Hindutva and authoritarian populism? You have a lovely but passing discussion of how in some of the cases, the types of excluded populations in the more remote urban corridors that you talk about provide fodder for Shiv Sena, for some of the right-wing political mobilizing. So I'm wondering therefore, whether in some sense you could talk a little bit about the different types of political formations and the ways in which the types of dynamics that you describe here feed into, or not, as the case may be, the types of hegemony, really, that has now emerged in and around Modi, and what, and if these types of farmer protests of perhaps of a different sort might imply for his future. Thank you very much, Sai. Terrific book, and I look forward to our conversation.
All right, thank you. Sorry, can you hear me properly? I was dumped from my computer, and so I'm not. Yeah, I'm clear. Okay, great. Thanks. All right. I apologize. You know, even though we're more than a year into Zooming, I was dumped, and I missed some of your brilliant comments. But as usual, what I heard was very engaging. First of all, I have the book right here, and I wanted to say, this sort of event is primarily, I think, to celebrate the book by our new colleague, Sai Balakrishnan. Welcome to Berkeley, and everyone, get the book, read the book. It is a major accomplishment from the perspective of Marxist agrarian studies. Michael has said this already, and from agrarian geography, there's much to appreciate. Agrarian studies has long offered an explanatory framework to apprehend geographically uneven paths of change. And I think, Sai, you're obviously right that urban studies has much to gain from this, not just from this approach in general, and from the insights of the agrarian studies tradition. In many ways, this is posed as a set of agrarian conditions for a particular set of urban forms of or infrastructural forms, if you prefer. productions of space built on variation and complexity that continue to be a feature of agrarian capitalism everywhere. The specific debates in this agrarian tradition that speak to how the uneven and combined development of capitalism and agriculture enables or forestalls trajectories beyond agriculture. That debate is the debate on agrarian transitions. In what ways do varieties of agrarian capitalism provide land, labor, food, other commodities, financial surplus, forms of expertise forged in the agrarian milieu, and how these resources transferred beyond agriculture to fuel the production of non-agricultural spatial formations. And to my mind, the book adds complexity to this framework in multiple ways. First of all, it's clear that the agrarian transition is a two-way street, to put it sort of crudely. Agrarian power and political economy continue to be in dialectical relation with the infrastructural forms, whether, in the earlier forms, railways, irrigation systems, or these new forms of urban settlement and circulation corridors with their logistical financial entailments. So I read it not just as an argument that colonial and green revolution transformations, agrarian transformations set conditions for investment in the corridor, but that agrarian politics and political economy continues to play a role in their futures. And I think that's exciting and important, and some of the surprising elements Michael's just pointed out. So that one creative tension that I read in the book, and perhaps a creative tension side that is intentional because it speaks to multiple audiences, is in the setting up of a set of case studies and a natural experiment, while showing that the cases are intricately interlinked through geographies of agrarian change, of sugar, finance capital, the powerful elite political and economic layer of a class differentiated caste bloc, the Maratha Kanvi alliance, the powerful political families emerging from sugar plantations and so on, with Sharad very much at the center of the entire book. I wonder if you could speak about the setting up of cases in a natural experiment vis-a-vis these connected historical geographies of Maharashtra, part of the broader set of interlinked geographies that you laid out briefly in your presentation as well across the country. What is interesting is that the way you pose it perhaps speaks to different kinds of social scientists, and different kinds of, so an ethnographer would get something from this book that that would be quite different from a more positivist social scientist looking for, natural experiment and so on. Third, it seems to me that the book is a model for studying elites. The way in which you've used right to information and so on, and sort of tried to negotiate ways of understanding these networks of power and patronage. And I would invite you to speak a bit about how this has helped you get inside the dominant narrative of political and economic change, and how that you've tried to unsettle that narrative as well. Turning to the three places that you focus on, Magarpata city, Lavasa, Cade city, and in a sense they aren't dominant interests maintained in all three in different ways, although as you say that the middle peasant is the Maratha Kanvi middle peasant is a key figure. On the different kinds of class and caste compromises, different local hegemonies, I wonder if you could comment on that. And turning to other possibilities, your normative focus, and you said this in your short presentation, as well as in the potential role of Gram sabhas as a kind of democratizing influence in neoliberal times, or spaces of recognition, as you put it, also spaces of presenting an obstacle to circulation, as you spoke about. cage seems to be the place in which Adivasis find new possibilities in this way, while also taking on undue risk burdens vis-a-vis their shareholder partners. The local Maratha Kanvi middle peasantry. I read this as guardedly optimistic, and you've also said more about this about the limits to the possible use of Gram Sabhas as counter movements to liberalization and to moditva. I wonder a bit more, if you could say a little bit more about Lavasa and how and why Gram Sabhas don't play that role. You certainly puzzle over it in the book, and I wanted to think with you a little bit about Anoki Parekh's work, which you engage her dissertation, which, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought the argument there was that dispossession in what became Lavasa was affected over a very long period, and through market mechanisms, through multiple small transactions that effectively prevented the kind of politics that Mike Levian describes, a kind of politics of dispossession modeled on politics of production, that he argues is the pan-Indian phenomena. And I thought that Anoki's dissertation shows why that is in a sense circumvented, and also potentially that's also why Gram Panchayats, which emerge later, do not do not become a side of a contestation or counter movement, as you put it. So I wonder if you could comment on your difference of interpretation there on how you think about Lavasa. Finally, the title of the book, Shareholder Cities, it's provocative, both as a category that can link these cases of stories of agrarian transition and urban change. I wonder if you can reflect on that now, if you would reflect on the sort of limits and possibilities of focusing on that aspect of this longer process with its multiple and quite complex stories, and the point that Michael just made about the fragmentation of the smallholders, of multiple claimants on pieces of land, and these figures becoming now shareholders, and the kinds of possibilities that emerge through that process. It's such a rich, complex story. I wonder if you could think about how your framing has captured it at the end of it. And linked to this, I'm wondering if you could say more. You laid out, I think, quite rightly, that kind of emergence of radical urban studies in the 1970s was actually blithely indifferent to the radical emergence of agrarian studies, Eric Wolf and all that, at exactly the same time. And partly it's a north-south thing, but of course we want our books to be read by everyone. And I wonder if you could think a bit about how you'd like your book, now that it's out in the world, how you'd like it to be read by urban and metropolitan studies, beyond experts or people interested in the intricacies of Maharashtra, who will definitely read this, or agrarian South Asia, agrarian and industrial South Asia. You're quite generous to urbanists who are like Stephen, Graham and Marvin, Splintering Urbanism, who actually have no idea that agrarian studies has made an argument about, in what they call splintering, about differentiation, spatial social differentiation as part of the workings of capitalism. They're sort of blithely indifferent to that as well in their formulation, but you're quite generous to these to urban studies. Economic geography, you point to, is quite myopic about this as well. So what should urban studies learn from your book? Why do you think it should be read widely, as I think it really should be? That's my last plug. I just want to remind the audience that even though I'm challenged here by the internet, please post questions in the Q&A while Sai engages our comments. We'll have time to turn to questions.
Michael, Sharad, thank you so much for an incredibly careful and generous reading of the book. I will be selective in responses, largely because it's just so much food for thought, some really, really big questions, and I need to think about these more carefully. But let me start with Michael's question on the classical agrarian question, right? And of course, what is striking in Western Maharashtra and more largely in this entire Green Revolution arc is the persistence of the smallholder, right? So Kotsky's agrarian question is spot on here, and Michael just wrote a wonderful afterword in a book edited by Asha Gertner and Bob Lake, where he gets into Kotsky's agrarian question and why it's important to think about the specific framing, the figure of the smallholder in this contemporary processes of land commodification. And what's striking in India is for political parties across the political spectrum, right, across the left and the right, and Andrew Sartori writes about this, the critique of land grabs is made in a defense of petty proprietorship, right? And we have to ask the question why, because it's the agrarian petty proprietors who are really the key protagonists in these processes. Now, the one thing that we should, of course, remember is it's not just petty proprietors in India, but it's petty proprietors who belong to a very, very specific caste, and that's the middle caste, right? And the middle caste, so the middle caste that I talk about in my book is the Marathas. Sharad, in his wonderful book, Fraternal Capital, talks about an equivalent, a regionally equivalent middle caste of the Gaundars in the state of Tamil Nadu. And why these middle caste proprietors are a very important social category for India is, on the one hand, they are an important countervailing force to the Brahminical hegemony of the post-colonial state. Right, so the post-colonial state, the Nehruvian state, had largely Brahmin, upper caste, technocratic elites, policymakers, politicians, who deluded themselves that they were quote unquote casteless moderns, right? And it's really these middle castes of agrarian origins who burst onto the national parliamentary scene in the 1980s, and scholars have referred to this as the second democratic upsurge. And it's a very, very important moment of democratic deepening in India, often referred to by scholars as the plebeianization of Indian politics, right? So the middle caste is extremely important because they are challenging this myth of the casteless moderns, and they're really taking on the Nehruvian state, right? But at the same time, the middle castes have a very hostile and antagonistic relationship to subaltern Dalits and Adivasis, right? And it's precisely this contradictory class position that makes them, and that's why the reference to Kotsky is spot on, because they do occupy this contradictory class position. So let me just say the key protagonists then as the petty proprietors, but really belonging to this middle caste. And those of you who follow Indian politics, it's the category of the OBCs, the other backward castes, right? Now what's crucial here is, you know, on the one hand, there is a deepening of democracy. It's in the 1980s that the middle caste really gained significant political power, including at the national level. And it's precisely at this time, and again, Sharad's book is important here, this is the context of a major economic transformation in India, where the state is retreating from its prior commitment to import substitution industrialization and is shifting to the flexible specialization. Sharad's book is all about one of these flexible specialization industrial clusters, right? So it's at this moment when the middle castes are gaining democratic power, that they're also increasingly left out of this new economy, this new globalizing economy, right? So that's an important context to keep in mind, because they're entering an economy that many economists call jobless growth. Many of these middle caste youth are exiting agriculture, 1990s onwards, but they have nowhere to go. They're not getting absorbed in any formal manufacturing. They're not getting absorbed in the urban formal economy. So in that sense, I think it's very important, particularly within the Green Revolution arc. Of course, Mike Levine in his book talks about regimes of dispossession. It's this question of why real estate becomes a very, very important driver of the economy in the post-1990s, in post-1990s India. And it's important because for many of these politicians, real estate really offers some economic pathway out of agriculture, right? So this is, there are no manufacturing jobs. The middle caste youth are not going to find work in the quote unquote, the new knowledge economy. And land liberalization is really pushed forward by politicians like Sharad Pawar, like Deve Gowda, who are really trying to ease the entry of their middle caste young constituents into an urban economy where there are no jobs, right? So everyone here now becomes this real estate hustler, right? And I think that's a very, very, that's also a reason why we're seeing the emergence of the rentier state, which is aggressively pushed forward by politicians of agrarian origins. So that's not very well sketched out answer to a very, very big question that Michael asked on the classical agrarian question, right? Because it's largely this question that there is this surplus labor, there is this enfranchised middle caste youth who don't have jobs. So it's an enfranchised, unemployed surplus population, right? That in some ways has to be pacified, that in some ways has to be managed by a democratic state. And let me just connect this to both Sharad's point on the elites and Michael's point on Hindutva, because of course, during much of the 20th century, there was this very, very careful construction of this middle caste category. The middle caste is made up of a large number of jatis, right? So even caste is, for those of us, the social life of caste is lived through jatis in India, right? And the jatis it's a vast unmarked category. And there was a careful construction of this middle caste constituency. Post-1980s, we are seeing an unraveling. We're seeing caste cleavages within the middle caste, right? So for instance, the more elite of these middle castes are able to exit agriculture and form transnational alliances. So some of the work that I continue to do in Western Maharashtra, there are sugar elites who have now formed transnational alliances. They're actually buying up land in Colombia, right? So they're part of a transnational capitalist alliance. But there's a large majority of the middle caste which is left behind, right? And there's a deep politics, what Rajeshwari Deshpande calls a deep politics of frustration and anger, right? This is also the case of the Gaundars that Sharad writes about in his book. The left behind Gaundars actually formed a new political party because they have they don't see a future for themselves either in the agrarian economy or in the urban economy. And it's precisely this left behind enfranchised middle caste that's caught between, on the one hand, agrarian exit and urban exclusion, right? They have nowhere to go. And that's the group that's being mobilized by the Shiv Sena, by the MNS, by all of these nativist, xenophobic political parties, right? And I think the line that Michael was referring to from the book, it's something that I would like to develop further. But if we had to think about India's left behind middle caste, who are caught between agrarian exit and urban exclusion in a more transnational frame, I think it would be worth thinking about a family of resemblance with, say, the white working class, right, that supported Trump. Because this was a group that did rely on racialized privileges, but they're threatened both by the rise of formerly oppressed groups, African Americans, and they have a deep resentment of cosmopolitan coastal elites, right? So in that sense, I think there's perhaps some work to be done in juxtaposing the white working class that really was behind Trump's victory with the left behind middle class. Cooperatives. So cooperatives, production politics. And Michael, I was very, very inspired by David Stark, and I have an article. If I had to rethink this, Sharad, I would have probably called my book Recombinant Urbanization, which is what I called an article. But you're right, Michael, it's not settling, right? Like there really is this, I mean, it's recombinant, right? Like these agrarian genealogies are coming together with the urban corridors, and you're getting new institutional forms, right? And new constituencies are emerging. So I think recombinant is spot on. And I do have an article called Recombinant Urbanization, which is inspired by David Stark. But I think in terms of cooperatives, it's worth thinking, unpacking this cooperative, this particular property form a little more, right? Because of course the cooperatives in India are premised, the agrarian cooperatives in India are premised on private property. But at the same time, they do have a communitarian ethic, right? It's really through the cooperative form that caste exclusion and caste power gets reproduced, right? But at the same time, I do think it's worth looking at it alongside Yutien Singh and Gillian Hart's work on the TVEs, the town and village enterprises in China, which of course come out of the Maoist legacy of collectives. But again, that's the case of industrial accumulation without dispossession, right? Which is what I'm talking about in Western Maharashtra. And I think another really helpful book to think cooperatives alongside is, of course, Catherine Bergery's The Vanishing Hectare. Because she also makes a very, very similar point that surprisingly, after the land reforms of the 1990s in Transylvania, it was not these 50 to 200 hectare farms, the commercial farms that start to thrive, but there's really a persistence of these smallholders, right? And it's this question of why do they persist, and how are these prior property institutions enabling the persistence of these smallholders, which connects to the question of why don't I use neoliberalization in the book? Largely because I think if you're thinking about the cooperatives as a property institution, and Andrew Sartori has written about liberalism at the edge of empire, we have to define what the prior form of liberalism is. And the form of liberalism at the edge of empire, particularly in South Asia, was very, very different from the West. And perhaps that needs to be unpacked a little more. Sharad, you asked me a lot of questions on really, really important questions on Lavasa and the title of the book, which I'll probably just bracket a little bit now. To your point on natural experiment, I should have called it relational geography, right? That's what I was trying to show, that it's a relational geography. You cannot understand Magarpata without understanding its combined but uneven relationship with Lavasa and these other agrarian property regimes. But I'll actually end with this really important question that you asked me on why should those in the US, for instance, why should Metropolitan Marxists read, not just read this book, right, but be concerned about the agrarian transition, the agrarian question in much of the global South. And I think it's a really important question. It's a question that my colleagues, Teresa Caldera and Stephen Collier, have also been pushing me to answer. And, you know, even within the United States, there is a plurality of the agrarian question, right? The agrarian transition in, say, the Midwest, which is what Terence Byers is really focusing on, the family farms as the route to Fordism, right? It's not a surprise that Fordism takes root in the Midwest, is a very, very different agrarian trajectory compared to where we are, right? The Central Valley. The Central Valley has always had large corporate agriculture. And one of the ways in which I'd like to start thinking about the ways in which the agrarian question should really travel to the United States is to look at the Central Valley, right? How can we understand the emergence of Fresno, that Fresno now has what, like the highest real estate price amongst smaller cities in the United States? How do we understand, how do we foreground Fresno and Stockton and really make them the core of our agrarian urban canon and embed them within the prior agrarian histories, the agrarian political economies of the Central Valley, right? So I think there's a very, very important argument to be made for the agrarian question to travel to the United States, right? So I'll just end here, but again, thank you for such a generative engagement with the themes of the book.
Thank you, Sai. So we have several questions, and I'm just going to distill a few of them. If it's okay with you, just if you could take them as a set, you can do whatever you.
Yes, please.
Whatever what you please with them, right? Okay, so the first one is the one that came up when I was just logged off for a second. Can this form of urbanization be seen as Gramscian, considering that the agriculturalists are in a way consenting to change in land use? That's the first question. Then Ramya Ramnath asks, I'm sorry, I was logged off again for some reason. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. Okay, Ramya Ramnath asks, I consider the Gram Sabha borrowing Fraser's phrase both exclusionary and having elements of bourgeois masculinist form of deliberative democracy. Are we giving these public assemblies far too much credence? It is rather masculinist sphere of oral democracy. Okay, that's a great question. Aditya Ramesh asks, is there now an unevenness within unevenness emerging? In other words, does the trajectory of green revolution, sugar, rice, wheat, and so on matter for the nature of corridor urbanism, or is this abstracted into the new urbanization moment with petty proprietorship? And Adam Jadhav asks, can you say more about what you see as the potential of the Gram Sabha outside the geographies of Maharashtra? Is it truly pan-Indian? Can you expand, for those of us who haven't read, why the Gram Sabha is resistant to extant hierarchies, especially those being mobilized by Hindutva hegemony? Maybe we should pause there.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So on Gramscian and hegemony, I mean, one of the main critiques of the book is that even if you're in one of these cases, in one of these SEZs, the special economic zones, it was Adivasi smallholders that were included as shareholders in this new real estate experiment, right? And one of the main critiques of the book is that by framing land commodification through this language of shareholders, really through this language of market fundamentalism, right? I mean, because what you have here is the emergence of property citizenship, right? That you have to own land, even if it is just a 1 acre plot of land. That's what distinguishes you from a landless constituent, right? So yes, you could think of this as Gramscian hegemony, but I think it's also important when we think about Gramsci and the other influences of Gramsci, particularly for South Asian subaltern studies. Gramsci's Southern question becomes very, very important, right? And Gramsci is making this really, really important argument. And of course, Partho Chatterjee, a lot of the other, the heirs to Gramsci, as Perry Anderson says, are taking up on this Southern question, that we have to think about political forms of solidarity across peasants and workers, right? And I think this comes through very, very strongly in India, right? So when I was talking about this migrant crisis, the fact that you have these migrant workers who work as peasants, right? That's just a source of livelihood, right? But they still depend on this marginal plot of agricultural land in the lower Gangetic Plain. That's their safety net during a crisis. But then they migrate as workers, as urban informal workers, to work in these enclaves, in these former Green Revolution enclaves, right? And so how do you really think about this category of peasant and worker? Which connects to the question on the Gram Sabhas, and I think that's a fair point, right? Is there a masculinist ideal within the Gram Sabha? But perhaps another institution of hope is really the social movement of the NAPM, the National Alliance for People's Movements, right? The National Alliance for People's Movement was very, very active in Western Maharashtra. And what was not surprising, because of course they're so grounded and they know how uneven spatial development works, is on the one hand, they're mobilizing peasants who are displaced by big dam projects, right? Because it's precisely these big dams, the water from these big dams, which is making these urban enclaves possible. And at the same time, they are mobilizing urban informal workers, right? So again, there's a way in which the NAPM necessarily straddles the agrarian-urban divide, necessarily straddles the peasant-worker divides. So I think that would be a much more hopeful institution to look to, right, as a social movement. The question on unevenness within unevenness, and I think I partly answered this when I was talking about Hindutva, right? The unevenness within unevenness is really the unraveling of this carefully constructed middle caste, and you're starting to see these class cleavages within the middle caste. So I hope I answered all of the questions.
We have a few more. Thank you, Sai. Asim asks, except for the typical zoning regulation that would prohibit the conversion of agrarian land into real estate, mostly not possible in democratic settings like India, what other effective strategies could be implemented to reduce, if not stop, aggressive corridor and ribbon developments along highways? And I think maybe there's another question also from Asim, maybe you should put them together. Do you think any kind of regulations or transformations in real estate market has the potential to de-accelerate the conversion pace of agrarian land into shareholder cities? for instance, any major change that would largely prohibit rampant speculative nature of real estate market, thereby making these kinds of projects less alluring to upstart and wannabe urban elites. Would you like me to just say the rest and then you can take what?
Sure.
Adam
Thanks, Sharad.
Jadhav also asks about the farmer protests. I want to see the ongoing farmer protest political struggles there to expand beyond middle peasant defensive politics. I want to see the protests as radical, but they also risk defending the uneven agrarian development you have flagged. So I want to hear how the Gram Sabha might be a more radical, more inclusive institution. Matthew Schutzer asks, I wanted to ask about the ecological dimensions entailed in the layering of green revolution landscapes and corridor urbanization. Because sugar is such a water-intensive crop, how are long-term investments in agrarian irrigation being reconscripted within corridor urbanization? Of course, something you also engage in about. Is there a way in which what appear to be struggles over land can be decisively swayed by political control over water?
All right, so let me just start with Asim's question. I'm going to give a rather odd answer, particularly as someone who teaches in the United States, where eminent domain we know has such a bad, ugly history, responsible for urban renewal, really like the worst scars in urban planning because of eminent domain and urban renewal. But I'm actually going to call for new forms of eminent domain in India. And this is something that I write about in the book. Thanks to very, very progressive activists, bureaucrats turned activists, including Harsh Mandar, who's again now under the scanner with the Modi regime. There were very, very progressive clauses introduced into the new Land Acquisition Act, right? Because of course, the Land Acquisition Act is a colonial inheritance from the late 19th century. But because of the struggles of these bureaucrats turned activists, there are some very, very progressive clauses that have now been included in the Land Acquisition Act, into the new LARA, the new Land Acquisition Act, including a clause, and I'll just connect this to Adam's point on Gram Sabhas, including a clause for a social impact assessment, right? That any major land use change has to be publicly deliberated by the public assembly. I mean, that's a really, that is a progressive clause, right? If you want one. So it doesn't matter what your property status is, even if you're landless, right? You can stake your voice via the Gram Sabha, and there is a legal mandate that all land use decisions should be subject to the social impact assessment. So I would actually say that we need to, as opposed to relying on market mechanisms like land readjustment, which is what is being used for the new greenfield city of Amravati in Andhra Pradesh, we should actually go back to the more progressive forms of eminent domain, which we do have in India, thanks to bureaucrat activists. The question of ecology is an interesting one, because in my book I talk about the oddness of Western Maharashtra being the epicenter of cash crop sugarcane cultivation, because at the turn of the 20th century, the Western Maharashtra region was an arid scarcity zone, right? And it's really due to a very, very specific contingent set of historical geographical processes that an arid scarcity zone becomes the epicenter of a water guzzling cash crop like sugarcane, right? So yes, huge ecological implications. And in the research that I'm currently doing with the historian Arindam Dutta from MIT, we talk about this puzzle, right? The lower Gangetic plain, like if you look at some of the most conventional tenets of economic geography, the lower Gangetic plain has reliable rainfall. It's proximate to one of the largest river corridors, right? So in terms of transportation, the Ganga. And it also has one of the highest population densities, right? The Lower Gangetic Plain, despite the fact that it is a region of extreme agrarian distress, has a population density that's almost double that of the London metropolitan region, right? But it's precisely because of these late colonial era irrigation canals, the geography of these irrigation canals, that you have what Barbara Harris-White calls India's rain-fed dystopias. Right, regions that are rain-fed, regions that have reliable rainfall, which you would assume would agglomerate into cities, and that hasn't happened, right? So there is a grave political ecological crisis here, precisely because of these path dependencies. So I'll stop here.
There is a last question that has snuck in, and I wonder if you would like to engage it. It's Pranav Koteas. How do you see the role of state-federal relations affecting forms of political mobilization related to land corridors? Do you think there are serious structural disruptions that could be made possible by movements for separate state, like Vidarbha, for example? Is a certain kind and scale of mobilization of capital and caste constituents made possible simply by the current size of the state of Maharashtra? Last question.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I mean, the BJP, of course, won its election with the promise of separate statehood for Vidarbha, right? So uneven spatial development within the state of Vidarbha. But I'll probably end with this. So Patrick Heller, these urban corridors, of course, are part of a centralizing. A new centralizing development imaginary of the Modi state, right? It has to be seen in conjunction with new fiscal changes like the goods and service tax, the GST, the Hindutva project, right? So it is a centralizing developmental imaginary. But at the same time, I mean, it's striking, Patrick Heller talks about this, that the decentralization reforms in India, and I have this in my book, introduced nearly 240,000 voter accountable institutions where none existed before, right? And this is legally enabled by the constitutional amendment for decentralization, which means that you have a new political class of so this is 30 lakhs, is that 3 million? Of 3 million elected local representatives, right? So that really says something about the thickening of the local state, right? And the kinds of interruptions which are possible by the local state.
That's a great point to conclude. Sai, thank you so much for sharing insights of your wonderful book. Everyone, please run out and get it immediately. Shareholder Cities. Thanks to Matrix, thanks to Institute for South Asian Studies, thanks to Michael Watts, thanks to all the attendees, and thanks most of all to Sai.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Michael and Sharad, and thanks to Social Science Matrix.